So it's official, Squid Game Season 2 has finally dropped, and in fact began with potentially the best follow-up season that it could have possibly ever had from the success of Season 1. For Season 2, which was a season that many believe would flop and fail, has since proven to be everything we have come to expect and love from the Squid Game series. And in fact, Season 2's first episode immediately not only set the stakes and the levels of what we can expect coming into this season, but also managed to hook us with the potential of what the future of this series could possibly be like. Because immediately in that first episode we got bloody fights and death games, paired with a deep and intrinsic dive into the psychology of many in this world. We see obsession in various forms throughout the entire episode, as well as the depths people will go to just to satisfy that desire. But that's not all, as in this episode we also get an incredible amount of much needed detail and explanation around a character from Season 1 that was incredibly crucial and important. The salesman, a character who before Season 2 dropped was nothing more than a complete mystery to us, and in fact in many ways was also considered a Season 1 plot hole. But now before we of course discuss him and his extracurricular activities, I'd first like to talk about the display between Gi-hun and his obsession with ending the games. Because I honestly think the way it's been shown and handled in the beginning couple of episodes of the show was absolute genius and borderline literary perfection. You see, immediately the season began where we left off, showcasing that Gi-hun was willing to sacrifice seeing his daughter again in America just for a chance at ending the games, immediately highlighting not only his obsession with ending these games but also his deep struggle with his survivor's guilt following Season 1. Which of course is something I think many of us would have missed or just not noticed unless it was directly pointed out. But something I also think is a major driving factor behind everything Gi-hun has done and will do in this season. For you see, when you really look at Gi-hun's character, you begin to see that he is someone who believes himself to be unworthy of almost everything that he has. The money, the win, and even the life he currently lives. He sees the ones that lost in Season 1 as way more deserving than him of simply just being alive. Which is seen in the way that he only ever uses their blood money for both them and for ending the games that took them from this world. He doesn't ever touch the money or use it on himself in any way, shape or form. Which for someone like him who came from absolutely nothing is an incredibly interesting factor and something that needs to be pointed out. But now the next area that I want to touch on surrounding his obsession is the way he spent every waking moment of every day hunting down the salesman, which of course at this time is his only lead and connection to the games. He spent hundreds of millions of won hoping for any sort of lead. He gets guys from all over to search everywhere, every possible station around Korea, for any sign that he might still exist. He does this, like I said, every single day of the week. It's become his life's purpose, his greatest obsession, and like I said, something that all stems from the guilt of being the only one to have survived Season 1. And that's exactly what's perfect about Squid Game's display of obsession and regret, at least as far as Gi-hun is concerned. It's not only seen throughout his day-to-day actions surrounding the salesman, but also something that is displayed throughout the entire Season 2, in both his demeanor and interactions with others. With even his closest friend Jung-bae, or number 390, pointing out that Gi-hun is now a completely different person than the one that he knew 3 years ago. This of course has all been brought about by Gi-hun's obsession with survival and the need to save everyone. Like he does absolutely everything he possibly can to convince everyone in the games to simply leave, failing almost every single time but trying and trying again to the very end, almost as if he's bouncing his head off a wall that will just not budge. But now, like I said, I'll be covering that in more deeper detail in future videos across the channel, so be sure to subscribe so as not to miss out on any of them. But just know that the complexities around Gi-hun's character since winning the first game has hit an all new peak. And so far, what I've spoken about in this video is just the beginning and the surface level stuff. I do plan to dissect him in much more detail across later videos, but for that of course I need more time to rewatch the show another couple of times to fully understand who he truly is. But now another noticeable obsession seen throughout the season that I just want to point out actually comes from the police officer himself, and it's his obsession to find and save his brother, believing for much of the show that he's still the same old big brother that he remembers from before, even refusing to ever share the identity with Gi-hun and the others a number of times throughout the show out of fear that they'll eventually find him and kill him before he has a chance to speak with him. His obsession and trauma in this moment is so deeply dug into him that he begins to see flashbacks of the event on the island, almost highlighting how every single thought that he possibly has is of getting his brother back from the games. And I feel as though he almost convinces himself that it's the games that is almost holding his brother at gunpoint, not ever wanting to imagine that it might be his brother's choice to remain at the games, which is incredibly interesting for his character in many ways, because in Season 1 he was a brave and fearless man who always let the evidence guide his way. But now in season 2, he's almost displayed as a scared and delusional fool who can't seem to see the things that are right in front of his face. It's interesting because while many of us would see his obsession and need to save his brother as idiotic and almost stupid in many ways, it's also incredibly relatable and incredibly well written, and has essentially turned him from a character that I didn't like much in season 1 into potentially my favourite character from season 2. And I do believe many of you would probably agree with me on that. He's incredibly well developed at this point in time. But now, like I said earlier, the first episode did also explain something and someone else that I myself was incredibly interested in the first season. The salesman, who is almost one of the most important characters of all of Squid Game, as he is essentially the guy that began it all for all of us. Now, what's incredibly interesting to me, and likely many of you, was just how interesting and complex this character actually turned out to be. Because I'm not gonna lie, coming into it, as much as I wanted to know more about him, I always saw him as nothing more than the salesman. But of course, he has been proven to be much more than that. For you see, the salesman is someone who began working in the games like we all suspected as little more than a grunt, just another of the circles who was trusted to do nothing more than dispose of the bodies. He had nothing much going for him aside from that, and even saw himself as worthless in many ways. This was all the way up until the moment that he was finally given a gun for the very first time. It was here that he began to feel like he was finally noticed, finally someone, and that's an incredibly big factor about his character, but we'll come back to that in just a second. Now, it wouldn't of course be until much later when he was pushed to an option of killing his dad that his bloodlust and obsession for these games began to truly show its head. For you see, after this, he began to enact his own version of the games that didn't involve life and death decisions, but games that preyed upon the desperate and needy. Games he of course played with the hopeless and the homeless. And this is of course seen in the first episode, where we get an example of this when he offers one of two things to the homeless. Either they can take the food and satisfy their hunger, or take the risk of the scratch card and potentially win a large amount of money. But now of course, as we all know, when dealing with scratch cards, you more often than not lose everything you tried to win. Which of course is what happened to the majority in this situation. Which of course then led to him taking the food that many of these poor people needed desperately and just began to destroy it all, highlighting that he wasn't the one who wasted it, and in fact it was all of them who did, by choosing to gamble rather than to eat. So while in this moment he looks like an absolute nutjob and a bit of a dick, it was the people's choices that ultimately led to this moment, not him, and he is not all that bad for doing it, in my opinion at least. And in many ways, this is also the truth behind the games. They continue because the world continues to make the wrong choices. The games always allow you to leave. It's the greed of the many that keep you hanging on that edge. It's that need to win just a little bit more that keeps you going, hoping that the next spin will be what you've always wanted it to be. But that's the thing, the gamble never ends. You can never leave on a win, and you can never end on a loss. You're always stuck going for that next big prize. It's something that's scaled up and made much more dramatic in the TV show, but it's something that as of recently has resonated with a lot of people in the real world in many ways. Because there's of course something that's currently known as a gambling pandemic going on around the world, and millions of people are suffering, losing almost everything they've ever had to the gamble. Sure, we can sympathize with them to an extent, and we all feel sorry for them for losing everything. But like Squid Game points out a number of times, it ultimately comes down to their own doing. It's their own stupidity that allows them to keep going, to keep gambling, to hope that the next one is what they will always want it to be. Which is why for a lot of people, myself included, we struggle to see and pity them in many ways. Because it's essentially their own doing. But now why do I point this out? Well, it's because I want to highlight how obsession, greed, and inevitable failure all go hand in hand with one another. To obsess over what you don't have leads you to greed once you gain even just a little bit. And it's this greed that inevitably leads you to that inevitable failure and suffering, the thing you've been so trying to avoid. It's an intense topic and issue that I myself am still currently learning, but it's something I felt belongs in a video about obsession and greed, so I said fuck it, we'll add it in. But now we're getting a little off topic, so let's just get back to the salesman and his reason behind his own games. Why does he play them? Well, in many ways, it's likely some sort of superiority power play for him, something that for a moment made him feel better than all of those around him, which in many ways is why the games even exist for many of the VIPs. Sure, they're made for the sheer enjoyment of the rich, but I also believe it can't be understated how superior they must feel when seeing these ants fighting, struggling, and killing for a taste of what they can offer. And I do also believe this relates back to the salesman himself, with his Subway games. For you see, he doesn't play the mini games because he's told to. No, he does it to feed his obsession and need to be superior. He's hired as a distributor of cards, not a game master or a VIP. He's just, as he puts it, an average salesman. Nothing more, nothing less. Which is something I do believe he slightly despises to an extent. I believe he'd much prefer to be the guy in the black mask, the man in charge of it all, which is an incredibly big reason behind why he plays his games in the first place. Sure, it's like I said, for the rush and the pleasure of beating and being better than everyone else, but it's also to fill that desire of what he will never get to be. The guy in the black mask. The man who decides who lives and who dies. But now, like I said, for the most part, this is all just my early thoughts on the characters of the show and their obsessive traits. And I'm currently in the process of rewatching the series for a second time, so hopefully my understanding will be a lot better in the coming videos, but I do also believe that I've got most if not everything right in what I've mentioned here today. So if you enjoyed and agree with anything I've said, then please consider liking and subscribing down below, as I would really appreciate it. But for now, that's going to do it for me in this video. I hope you all have a great day or night wherever you are, and peace.